I really love that notion of twisting. And I thought I wanted you to talk about that term a little bit more because I know that you lay out this framework of cuir, right? CUIR is one of the ways and yet I wonder about the traction of that term in your research amongst people. If that is, it feels purely academic, right? Because it is a spelling, it's less of a pronunciation when you're in a Spanish speaking context or world. But what are other ways that you can imagine? I think that's a really term, and I feel like it has a long life, and that you could do a lot with that notion of twisting. Yeah, just wondered if you could say a little bit more about it, if you see that there's a life with it in whatever research project you're doing next.
Yeah, I think I came to the term in reflecting about the reemergence of the term lesbiana, and at the same time the term queer being so present in North American academia, we could say. When I started looking a little bit further into it, it was not necessarily two parallel tracks, but rather the terms queer and lesbiana intermingling and responding to one another. And the difficulty, as I pointed a little bit earlier, to find one single canon, but rather seeds, right, that are planted around the idea of queer and lesbiana, and springing in a particular time and place together. So maybe I'm offering a different analogy than twisting right now, talking about seeds and what springs, but I think it's this idea of a mixing, right, of these terms that conceptually can be useful to separate in an academic paper and so on, but that in everyday life, when we think about the development of academic work, but also on the ground, these terms come together, sometimes are used interchangeably, and sort of pollinate kind of new ideas in some ways. So that was how I was interested in twisting, but also, as you remark, queer is not a term that is very widely used, in my experience, at least in the circles that I have been in Mexico City. There are a few examples that I could find, such as the organization Macias de Metal, which at some point had the term queer in its webpage, but which actually has been changed for back to women now, which I find interesting and kind of like goes with my argument that the type of national activism that has sprung in Mexico around gender against gender violence has had an influence in the ways in which people think of themselves and in the ways in which politics are produced on the ground. But at the same time, the term queer as CUIR, I believe, has some kind of reach when we think about it in Latin America, and the scholarship that has been developed in the past couple of years. I was just working with a colleague, Gloria Gonzalez Lopez, on a short, it's not really an encyclopedia, but it's like a handbook of terms of queer in Latin America last month, and really looking at the knowledge that has been produced in that sense. And we see some people who see the term queer as a colonial imposition, and we see other authors, for example, Sayak Valencia comes to mind, who see queer as a bridge between minoritized gender and sexualities in North America and in Mexico and Latin America, and how the term queer in a way could be thought of a transborder term that circulates above a particular geography and connects people. And we see also different academic organizations or groups that are emerging and bringing queer as CUIR, making it as a stronger presence in Latin America. But at the same time, I have real questions around that. Like sometimes when I think of the term queer, at least in the North American context, I'm starting to feel old. We could think about other terms that are gaining more, that are circulating, such as we can think of queer theory, but we can think of trans theories also that I think are certainly circulating, and in the context of Latin America, terms such as transfeminismos, which are also gaining traction at this moment. And so I think queer, CUIR, is a useful term, but I also think that is, I don't know what is the future of it necessarily. I am under the impression that there are other terms and other questions that are emerging around transfeminismos, or the use of the term Latine or E as an ending, instead of using Latina, Latino, or Latinao with the @ sign, the arroba sign. And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered the question. I went into a tangent.
No, you did. I like it. It's just, I think about how I start to dig my heels in even more, right? Like tacones down in the dirt. Like I'm going to hang on to lesbiana. I'm going to hang on to lesbian, hang on to Chicana, and queer women of color, right? Because I think it's true what you're saying around these terms losing some currency or some urgency, and in that way, then the way that lesbian and the way that your article and my article think through the various moments of it sort of reaching this interesting public currency and then sort of dropping out, and then you think, oh, these things kind of move, right? Like, are we going to come back to them, and are they going to, when we come back to them, will they have a different attachment? Will we have a different way of relating to them that feels either more urgent or powerful or timely? And I don't know, it's like my closet. Like I have a lot of vintage clothes in there, and I thought, I'm not giving away, as I'm moving, right? I am not giving away, as my partner's like, your clothes take up so much space. I feel a little guilty about that, but at the same time, I know that the classics and priceless, right? So I kind of want to hang on to lesbian and queer in that way. That sure, I can't get out of my generational markings, right? Like people will know that that's the generation that I'm raised in, and yet I feel very strongly about applying new meaning to them too, right? Not just for as much as I said digging my heels in, but not because I'm unshakable or unmovable, right? Or myopic about what these things mean. But I think that as language changes, so do our identities, and it can happen the other way around too, right? As our identities change, or as our identities become, in some ways, stabilized, right? As things change around us, and some of our terms of identification and some of the language can also reappear to have that meaning that was so powerful to us, that be something that we feel is important for us and critical for us to hang on to in the present. Yeah, I'm thinking that, as it's such an interesting and vibrant time to write about lesbians, period. There's a flourishing, right? There's a lesbian seems to be something that people are now gravitating toward. And it's almost like we can say in the US that the US is kind of taking cues now from the global South, right? Or from like non-US centric kind of identities as it moved away from lesbian, as it moved towards queer, and is moving towards trans and non-binary, that it's almost like women and lesbian, due to all the shit that's going down politically, now are sort of taking the cues from the global South to say, oh, we're going to use lesbian again, right? I see it. There's a lesbian in almost every television show that I watch now. Right? It used to be like the gay man, and now it's the lesbian, right? Like, there are 3 lesbian bars and clubs that popped up in the past couple of weeks here in LA. So there's something around lesbian, and I'd like to imagine that maybe it is that we're looking south right? Or east or elsewhere.